Live from Denver's Cherry Creek neighborhood, you are watching and listening to the Kyle Malnati Radio Show. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and I'm sitting here with Jud Brown from Alden Brown Co, an apartment owner and operator in central Denver. We are thankful for Stuart Title for providing us the space to record today, and we're hoping that in this new year, as you're looking at potentially buying an apartment building or adding to your portfolio, some of the topics that we cover today in the interview will be helpful to you, the apartment investor. So Jud is an apartment owner, and he's a third generation apartment owner. The history of Alden Brown Co starts back 5 decades ago. They have owned real estate in Denver for literally over 50 years. Impressive, and what I think is even more impressive than that is the fact that it's gone from Alden, the grandfather, to Daryl, Alden's son, to now Jud, Daryl's son. So it's 3 generations of family business. Jud, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
You've got 575 units over 14 buildings, and your grandpa started the business 5 decades ago. Jud, what's your story? How did you get started in the multifamily business, and kind of how is your family involved in multifamily?
Well, I sort of grew up in the multifamily business, obviously. Whether it was my dad getting the late night phone calls that he did, or him taking me into the office when he was himself painting and turning apartments. So I sort of got to play around the buildings as a small kid, and now having grown up in that and aged through that, I sort of saw what a good business it could be to go into.
And the business has grown quite a bit. Your grandfather started it and had a few buildings at the beginning, I'm sure as they were just learning the apartment business, and then your dad came on scene and the company really grew. So kind of walk through and unpack very quickly, kind of how that history has gone.
Yeah, that played out. My grandfather started actually as a strip mall developer in Denver, and then went into owning office space and hotels, and realized that was a little too much work for him. So he moved on to apartments, buying his first building in Capitol Hill in 1966. And from there, essentially, my dad, after school, came to work with him, and over the period of the next 30 years, they acquired another 12 or 13 properties.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. So Grandpa had a few buildings under his belt, and then when Dad came on the scene, and your dad's a real intelligent guy, went to Stanford as his undergrad, and then to Dartmouth for his graduate school, and worked for Arthur Anderson, as we were talking before the show started, and parlayed all of that knowledge, and said, I want to go back into the family business and really build this thing. And it's grown quite a bit since you've come on scene too. What do you remember as your first couple of jobs in the apartment business, both from when you were young and then now what's your current role within the organization?
Yeah, when I was young, I started out mostly helping the small maintenance staff we had at the time, turning apartments, painting, cleaning, learning what was clean and what wasn't clean when it came to letting new prospective residents move in. But as I got a little older and my dad trusted me a little more, we took on some larger projects, and the biggest one was removing the old heating system in a 1922 vintage building we have, 51 units. So we took out all the plumbing and the old radiators before installing new boiler and new hot water baseboard heat. That took almost a full summer into the fall before a mechanical company came in and installed the new system before winter.
Oh my goodness. Wow. And you disassembled this by hand?
Yeah, it was all by hand and Sawzall.
Oh my gosh. And folks, if you've never been in an apartment building before, boiler rooms are very tight, compact spaces, and the boiler basically fills 80 to 90% of the room in some cases. These older buildings have gigantic kettle-style boiler systems, whether it be steam heat or hot water heat. It's incredible, and when you deconstruct these things, it is messy work. Yeah. And doing that in the summer in a building that doesn't have air conditioning, I can only imagine that would be something that would be quite...
It was an eye-opening experience.
Well, as you look at your kind of past and how you learned the business from your grandfather and your father, now what's your role within the organization? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis? You're not pulling out boilers yourself.
Not pulling out boilers myself anymore. No, on a day-to-day basis, it's everything from pricing units and taking a look at what apartments need to be upgraded, during the turn cycle, and looking at potential new acquisitions, as well as anything from refinancing to rent increases, a bit of everything, which is the unique thing about this industry. You get to sort of spread your skill set over a broad area.
Yeah, it is fascinating how many different areas that you can plug into in multifamily. Commercial real estate is gigantic throughout the U.S. And then as you dive in to Denver and then to multifamily, it's amazing how many areas that you can be involved in. What factors at a young age do you think have contributed to your success? What are some things that you look at that you've done that have contributed to that success?
I would say the largest factor is the groundwork that my grandfather and father laid in terms of the buildings they acquired and the strategic sort of management platform that they put together. With all of our buildings within about a mile radius of each other, all on Capitol Hill, makes managing and running them a lot easier than having properties scattered throughout the city or even throughout the country, as some larger REITs do. That's probably the largest factor, and just their work ethic.
Yeah. Well, and are there any pressures that you feel being in the third generation now? And you look at this company that was started by your grandpa, and then obviously your dad has had a huge impact on the growth of the company. But what are your thoughts on being the third generation now?
Third generation, there's a phrase, third generation malaise, that goes along with a lot of family industries, and that by the time the third generation comes sort of to fruition or up, the resources are spread a little more thinly over a number of siblings or parents or whatever it may be, and that as a company's well developed, people tend to relax a little bit as opposed to looking forward and being as aggressive as they once were. And so that's something that I try to keep in mind every day and not let that happen.
Yeah, and you hear about all these successful business owners that have children, and they say, whether it's Bill Gates who's saying that, I'm going to donate the majority of my fortune to charity, and however you look at it, that once he passes on, that'll end up getting donated out through a 20-year period and pretty much doled out. And I think his family will still be okay, but you look at it by saying that I don't want my children to be impacted in a negative way because of the success that we've had. And then also you look at it and say, what's the legacy of the company, and how do you continue that when there's some distance between the generations? When you get 3 generations away and then 4 generations away, it's hard for the current generation to remember what it took to be successful, because it probably took a lot longer to accumulate 2 buildings for your grandpa than it has to get to 575 units now as a family. And probably that first 20 years looked a lot different than the last 20 or 30 from a growth pattern. So
absolutely.
It's interesting stuff, and something that I think about a lot of times too with my own family as I continue to be involved in the apartment business and have successes, whether they're small or big successes. How do I pass those on to my kids, and how do I teach them to still have work ethic and do the right things, say the right things, not be bratty little kids? And so I think that you're certainly well adjusted, and that was because your family was intentional about that. What do you think that your family does that is special or different from most other owners?
I think one of the biggest aspects is that we have a long-term hold strategy. We're not buying properties with the intent of flipping them and selling them in 3 to 5 or 7 years even. Majority of the properties we've owned for between 15 and up to 30 years. And in that time frame, we've only ever sold 1 building.
Wow, only one.
Only one, and that was to go into another one that was a little bit bigger. So I think holding long term is something that's a little frustrating at times, but at other times it's really nice to be able to build up in a portfolio like that and just sort of have those resources on hand.
Well, there's a radio host that I listen to a lot, and he's a thought leader, and he shares a story about interacting with a very successful business person, a billionaire. And the billionaire, he asked the question, which I'll ask to you as well, what's your favorite book, or what's the one book you've got to read if you want to become successful? And the guy says, it's The Tortoise and the Hare. And tortoise and the hare, the old fable, and how is that applicable? But the tortoise always wins. And even though it may not seem flashy, it may not seem like there's a lot going on, the tortoise just continues along on a methodical path. And over 50 years, you say, okay, here's where we've grown. So I think that's fascinating. What advice would you give to an aspiring investor that's wanting to buy their apartment building, maybe for the first time, or maybe they want to accumulate and build on their portfolio this year?
I would say, going along with what we were just talking about, is patience. One of the largest things. A lot of people rush into something that just sort of, your gut instinct is to move into it without doing full due diligence.
Yeah.
And some of our properties, my dad had been writing letters to the owners for 30 years. The recent acquisition we had in 2012, he'd been writing the guy letters for 30 years from when he first started.
Oh my goodness.
So things don't always happen right away.
Right.
But they do happen eventually.
Well, and what I respect with that story too is it being intentional. It's not only being diligent, but being intentional. You've got, writing those letters over 30 years, that's the diligence. But the intentional part is saying, I want that building. That building fits perfectly for our portfolio.
Yeah.
We talked about a book, and I believe that leaders are readers. What are you reading now that is interesting, and what's a book that you're reading right now?
Right now I'm reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I was a history major in college, so I read a lot of history books, as it were. But I just sort of like knowing where we come from, and I think that helps looking forward.
Yeah.
Just planning for the future, not necessarily in a real estate state of mind, but just knowing where we come from.
Well, I think when you're doing any investing, and this show is all about multifamily investing, looking at the past, it's a leading indicator to what's happening today, and then also it ends up projecting into the future. So I think the common quote is history tends to repeat itself, right? And what happens, I think, is as you get 5 or 10 years from a major event, and we're at about that point from the economic downturn in 2008, the apartment market is flying high, we've got record rents, we've got super low vacancy, and we've got an amazing amount of people buying apartment buildings. And I think about that and say, okay, well, we're going to have a downturn again. And what are you doing to prepare yourselves? And what are what are the things, are you ready for a vacancy? And that sounds crazy, but people are so used to something goes, a tenant provides their notice to vacate, and you got it rented before you even have to put it out to market vacant. You actually have it turned over the weekend, and that new tenant's moving out right when the old tenant has already left. We used to have vacancy for several months, and I know that in your experience that used to be the case.
Absolutely.
So prepare yourselves. It's history does repeat itself. We always share a quote on the Kyle Malnati Show, some inspiration, some things that I'm reading. The quote that we have today is from Jim Collins, the book Good to Great, and it ties in perfectly here with the topics we've been talking about. The quote is, "This brings me to one of the most crucial points of this chapter. A hedgehog concept is not a goal to be the best, a strategy to be the best, an intention to be the best, a plan to be the best. It is an understanding of what you can be the best at. The distinction is absolutely crucial." And so I'll unpack that very briefly. Hedgehogs, we probably all remember them. I remember playing a game called Sonic the Hedgehog, video game. But hedgehogs are not really the cutest little animals. They've got spikes over them. They look like a porcupine. And earlier in the book, Jim Collins talks about hedgehogs and foxes. Foxes are beautiful. They're cunning, sleek. The sly fox. And hedgehogs are kind of methodical, plodding, boring individuals like the tortoise, and the fox is like the hare. Well, what happens is the hedgehog walks along a path and the fox tries to eat the hedgehog. Every single day, the hedgehog curls into a ball and puts his quills up. And what ends up happening is the hedgehog just keeps plodding along. And so Collins brings this back to businesses and says, it's not important to have the goals or the strategy or the intentions or the plan. Those are all things that do contribute to the overall success, but really what's most important is to have an understanding of what you personally can be the best at. And I think that Alden Brown has done amazing job of understanding. We own Central Denver, we own Capitol Hill and Governor's Park apartment buildings. We own buildings built in the early part of last century, in the early 1900s, up through mid-century modern. You guys aren't, buying land out in outskirts and building new apartment buildings. You're continuing to acquire buildings that are a good fit for your portfolio and are geographically centered. And I think that all the smart owners do that. Jud, I really want to say thank you for joining us on the show today. I actually have a gift for you. Last show I commented about a book that I was reading last month called Procrastinate on Purpose and then Take the Stairs. These were both written by my personal career coach, who's a New York Times bestseller. So these are a gift to you.
Thank you.
Of course, and thanks for listening and watching the Kyle Malnati Show, where multifamily matters. And as I like to say, we'll see you around the neighborhood.